Good morning, Senior Pride here. Now, today I'm going to discuss a Canadian topic that is relevant worldwide because it looks at the kind of left-wing, right-wing political situation and how that impacts human rights. I'm going to specifically look at how having a new Democrat government or opposition in the after the new election, when it inevitably comes up, and probably quite soon, will impact human rights in Canada. I love comments. I I love what people have to say, regardless of what they believe, what they think. But please do your research first. And if you're not familiar with the Canadian political environment, remember that you really do need to do the research first. Don't just make comments based on male anger. Yeah, I can't believe I have to phrase that, but here we are. Also, if you enjoy these videos, please hit subscribe and like, and please share. And again, I love comments. I have no problem with respectful comments. I do have problems with uneducated, hate-based comments. And with that, here we go. So it is important to recognize that human rights are the cornerstone of any democratic society. Canada is known historically for having a strong commitment to human rights, and it has shaped our national identity. Yet, despite the fact that we are a global leader in human rights legislation, systemic issues do persist across many domains, including Indigenous rights, racial injustice, gender equity, disability rights, and social economic equality. Now, the New Democratic Party, or the NDP, has its roots in social democracy and has a long-standing focus on equity and justice. So they are uniquely positioned to champion human rights in Canada, either when, very likely, the Conservatives are elected into government, or if by some fluke they actually end up in government. I'm going to kind of give you a human right, like the current state of human rights in Canada. And again, we have the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. I've discussed this before. I'll continue to discuss it. It is very important to our value system, but the reality is deep-rooted inequities still exist. So Indigenous communities continue to face violations in basic rights, from lack of access to clean drinking water to systemic underfunding for healthcare and education. Individuals from racialized communities also face disproportionate rates of police violence, incarceration, and economic inequity. Gender inequities exist, with wage gaps and gender-based violence remaining prevalent. The LGBTQ plus community, despite progress and legal recognition, still face barriers to accessing inclusive healthcare and safe living spaces. Disability rights are often sidelined in political discussions, and persons with disabilities suffer from chronic underfunding and systemic inability in things like housing, public arenas, and employment. In economic inequality further exacerbates these disparities, with marginalized communities disproportionately impacted by poverty, lack of affordable housing, and an increasingly precarious labor market. The federal government has made efforts to address these issues, but these efforts have been inconsistent, and systemic change has been exceedingly slow. So there is an urgent need for comprehensive intersectional policies that prioritize the voices of marginalized. The NDP's historic commitment to social justice positions them to be our voice. Now, how could they potentially transform Canada's human rights framework? More likely as the opposition, but wouldn't it be nice if they were the leaders? Okay, you know where I stand. They could implement transformative policies to address these systemic inequalities, and they could improve human rights across Canada. They hold a vision for an inclusive society which emphasizes social and economic justice, Indigenous rights, racial equity, gender equality, disability rights, and climate justice. So they are uniquely positioned, as I said. So let's start with social and economic rights. The NDP has consistently advocated for economic equality as a foundation for human rights. So, for example, affordable housing. They have a commitment to building 500 affordable housing units within 10 years that could address the housing crisis that disproportionately affects low-income families, racialized communities, and individuals with disabilities. They have a commitment to universal pharmacare and dental care. They believe in expanding healthcare to include pharmacare and dental care, and believe that this would reduce disparities in health outcomes and ensure access to essential services. And for those Canadians who believe that pharmacare and dental care are very expansive right now, they are not. They're limited to a very small number of individuals within marginalized communities. They are limited in what is available. So, for example, if you need a medication that is vital to your basic health and it's not covered and you can't afford it because you're low income for one of many reasons, it really doesn't help. They're very limited at this time. They also believe in minimum wage and workers' rights, and they believe in raising the federal minimum wage to a living wage and strengthening labor protections, which would address income inequality and improve living standards for all Canadians, and particularly for those who are currently marginalized. They are strong believers in Indigenous rights. So they have committed to implementing the Truth and Reconciliation Committee's calls to action and the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. This includes things like clean water and infrastructure. So they want to ensure that all Indigenous communities have access to clean drinking water and adequate infrastructure, which would address decades of neglect. They believe in land and resource rights, so respecting Indigenous sovereignty through meaningful consultation and equitable resource sharing agreements that would uphold treaty obligations. They're strong believers in disability rights. So accessible housing and transportation. They would implement nationwide accessibility standards for housing and public transportation, ensuring that individuals with disabilities can live and work independently. And for those of you who think that employment equity isn't important or that it already exists for persons with disabilities, we need programs to reduce unemployment. We need to include hiring incentives for employers. We need to increase workplace accommodations, and we need to address systemic barriers. Because if you're worried about what is being spent on disability support income for persons with disabilities, or you don't seem to understand that, the fact is people on disability support could be reduced if people had more access to employment opportunities. It's just that simple. There's also a need, and this is something that the NDP recognizes, for funding these disability benefits at a level that would allow people to live independently, meet the basic cost of living, and not end up in states like homelessness, dangerous situations, the inability to eat or afford basic healthcare costs. that are not covered by universal health care. And speaking of healthcare, it's important to expand specialized services, mental health services, and assistive technologies that would support greater healthcare access for persons with disabilities. There's also the issue of racial justice and anti-discrimination. The NDP believes in policing and justice reform, which would redirect funding from punitive policing models toward community-based programs and mental health supports. And they believe in anti-racism initiatives, so funding education campaigns and enforcing stronger anti-discrimination policies in workplaces and schools that would help to combat systemic racism. There are also the issues of gender equity and LGBTQ plus rights in Canada. The NDP believes that expanding funding for shelters and programs to support survivors of gender-based violence. They believe in policies to close the gender pay gap, and they believe in increasing parental leave for all genders, which would promote greater equity in the workplace. They also believe in improving access to gender-affirming healthcare and strengthening protections for LGBTQ plus individuals in workplaces, schools, and public spaces. And as we know, in Alberta recently, gender-affirming care has taken a huge strike by the UCP government. We need to build on what we already had, not take it away. The reality is that the NDP will not likely be the leaders. They will likely potentially be the opposition. And one of the strengths that they have in that position is to hold the government, which will likely be the Conservatives, accountable. So, looking at things like Indigenous rights, affordable housing, climate justice, they can give pushback to a government that will likely try to erode all of these. There's the importance of building public awareness and grassroots mobilization, and this is a key strength for the NDP. They're very good at collaborating with human rights organizations, mobilizing public support through town halls, social media campaigns, and protests. They can amplify marginalized voices and push for systemic change. They are also quite effective at collaborating with other parties. So, just as an example, their collaboration was critical in the Liberal government's adoption of programs such as the Canada Child Benefit and pandemic-related income supports. They are good at negotiating policy improvements, and they can advance human rights through these policy changes, through this pushback. There are some limitations, there are some challenges. They would continue to face institutional inertia and systemic barriers, budget constraints, and opposition from powerful corporate interests. But at the same time, their influence, while it might be limited to advocacy and negotiation without direct policy implementation, could support and encourage policy implementation. They also have the difficulty or the challenge of balancing ideological goals with practical governance. So their commitment to progressive taxation and public spending may face resistance from voters and other political actors, and particularly large corporations. They have to build broader coalitions and maintain public trust and increase public awareness. They do have an unwavering commitment to equity, justice, and inclusion, and if they are elected, hopefully as the opposition, wouldn't it be nice if they were the governing party? They could certainly play a transformative role either way in addressing systemic inequalities here in Canada and advancing the rights of marginalized communities. So Canada is a leader globally in the area of human rights. But in order to maintain that, we need to work on increasing, not decreasing. We need to do things that make us stronger. And the NDP's approach, which is rooted in social justice and equity, offer a pathway to a more just and equitable society. The thing is, it is up to voters, it is up to activists, and it is up to policymakers to prioritize human rights in Canada. That is a simple reality. Again, if you enjoyed this video, please hit subscribe and like. Please share. Please, again, comment respectfully. And with that, I say to be senior is to be proud. Hugs.